Emily Harper hit her knees before she even made it to the porch. She didn't stumble. She didn't trip. The strength simply left her body all at once, the way a candle goes out, and she went down into the dust of her father's land with both hands pressed flat against the cracked earth like she was trying to hold it together or beg it to hold her. She was 26 years old. A widow. A daughter with no father left to bury. And now, looking up at the ruin of the only thing she had come back for, she understood for the first time what it meant to have absolutely nothing. If this story already has your heart subscribed to this channel right now, hit that notification bell and follow Emily's journey all the way through to the end. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. The letter had taken 3 weeks to find her. By then, Emily Harper was already behind on rent in a boarding house on the east side of Chicago, already eating 1 meal a day, to stretch what little she had left after Marcus died, already past the point where pride felt like something she could afford. The letter came from a county clerk in Elko County, Nevada, dry formal language, the kind of words that don't care how they land, and what it said was simple enough. Her father, Thomas Harper, had passed in February of 1874. The homestead on the edge of the Walker Valley Basin was now hers, by legal right, assuming no outstanding debts, assuming no disputes, assuming she could make the journey west and present herself to the county office within 90 days of the letter's postmark. 90 days. She'd read it standing in the hallway of the boarding house, still wearing her coat, a basket of laundry balanced against her hip. And she'd stood there long enough that Mrs. Calloway had come out of her kitchen and asked if something was wrong, and Emily had looked at the woman who'd been charging her 40 cents a week for a cot and a basin of cold water and said, "No, ma'am, something might actually be right." She sold what little she owned. A coat. A pair of boots with good soles. 3 books Marcus had left behind that she hadn't been able to part with until now. She counted what she got for them, added it to what remained of her savings, and bought a one-way train ticket to Elko, Nevada, because one way was all she could afford, and because she had decided in that hallway with that letter in her hand that she was not coming back. Nevada was nothing like she remembered. She'd spent the first 12 years of her life on that homestead before her mother died, before her father sent her east to live with her aunt, before the years of schooling and then marriage, and then Marcus's slow, terrible sickness, and then the long gray silence of widowhood, in a city that moved too fast to notice a woman standing still. She had carried a version of that Nevada land inside her for years. Green in her imagination. Wide and full of possibility. The land she stepped off the stagecoach onto was not green. It was brown and cracked and hot in a way that pressed down on a person like a hand on the back of the neck. The Walker Valley stretched out in every direction. Beautiful, yes, in the way that hard things are. Sometimes beautiful, but offering nothing easy, nothing soft, nothing that said, "Welcome home." The stage driver handed down her bag without a word, and the town of Millhaven received her with the kind of quiet indifference that frontier towns reserve for women traveling alone. She asked directions to the county clerk's office. She filed the necessary papers. She received a copy of the title bearing her name, Emily Claire Harper, sole heir, and a brief, unhelpful description of the property's current condition that included the phrase, "in some state of disrepair." She didn't know, riding out on the hired horse with her one bag strapped to the saddle, what "some state of disrepair" would actually look like when she arrived. She knew the moment she saw it. The fence along the road was down in 3 places, posts rotted through at the base and leaning into the scrub like old men giving up. The main gate had lost one of its hinges and hung at an angle that made it look like the property itself was turning away from visitors. Beyond it, the house she had been born in, the house where her mother had sung while she cooked supper, the house her father had built with his own 2 hands. Before Emily was old enough to understand what that meant, stood partially collapsed on one side, the roof caved in over what had been the sleeping quarters, the porch boards warped and buckled and covered in dead grass and debris. The well had a crack in the stone surround. The barn doors were off their rails. The garden her mother had kept, the one her father must have tried to maintain for years, was nothing but hard bare earth now. And the land, God, the land, Dry. Overgrown in the wrong places, stripped bare in others. Whatever her father had been trying to do in his last years, whatever fight he'd been putting up against the isolation and the weather and the loneliness of that place, the land had not been kind enough to remember it. Emily walked the horse through the broken gate. She dismounted slowly. She tied the reins to what remained of the porch rail and stood there in the afternoon heat, looking at all of it. And she tried to find the feeling she had carried with her all the way from Chicago, the sense of rightness, of return, of this is where I am supposed to be. What she found instead was a kind of absolute silence inside herself. Not peace. Something harder than peace. The kind of silence that comes just before a person breaks. She made it as far as the front steps before her legs gave out. She didn't fall dramatically. There was no grace in it. She simply went down onto her knees in the dust between the broken porch and the cracked earth, both hands pressing flat against the ground, and she stayed there while the heat rose off the land in waves and the late afternoon sun beat down on the back of her neck. She was not a woman who cried easily. Years with Marcus had dried something in her, or maybe it was the years before Marcus, or maybe it was just the habit she had built of being the only one left standing. But the tears came now without permission, without dignity, without any of the composure she had carried like armor for years, because there was no one to compose herself for. There was no one here at all. That was the worst of it. Not the ruined house, or the dead garden, or the collapsed fence. It was the silence. It was the absolute confirming silence of a place that had been waiting for someone to come back and had finally, after enough years of waiting, simply stopped. "You all right, ma'am?" The voice came from her left, and it was quiet enough that it didn't startle her the way a sudden sound might have. Just there. Steady. Like it had been there for a moment already, waiting for the right time. She did not look up immediately. She pressed her hands harder against the ground, gathered what she could of herself, and then pushed upright onto her heels and turned toward the voice. The man was on horseback, maybe 15 yards off, just inside what remained of the fence line. He was broad-shouldered, somewhere in his mid-30s, with a hat shading most of his face, and the kind of stillness in the saddle that said he had been raised on the back of a horse and never thought much about it. He wasn't leaning forward with curiosity. He wasn't backing away with discomfort. He was simply sitting there, reins easy in one hand, watching her with an expression that contained neither pity nor judgment, just attention. The particular kind of attention that belongs to a man who is deciding whether to stay. Emily got to her feet. She brushed the dust from her skirt with both hands because it gave her something to do with them. She straightened her spine. She met his eyes. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at the tears on her face. He looked at the house behind her. He looked back at her. "All right," he said. He didn't move. Didn't tip his hat and ride on. Just stayed where he was in that easy, unhurried way, as if the next move was entirely hers and he had nowhere else to be. "This is private property," she said. It came out sharper than she intended. She wasn't sure why she led with it, except that she had spent the last year and a half in a city where the only defense a woman had was the sharpness of her own voice. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "It's the Harper place. I've been keeping an eye on it since old Thomas passed." He paused. "You his daughter?" Something shifted in Emily's chest at the words, "old Thomas." The casual, respectful way he said it. Like her father had been known here. Like he had meant something to someone who hadn't been required to mean anything. "I am," she said, "Emily Harper." She hesitated, then added, "Mrs. Harper." "Daniel Brooks." He touched the brim of his hat. "My operation is the next spread north. Your father and I shared a fence line." Another pause. "He was a good man." "Yes," she said. He was. The silence held for a moment, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with everything she didn't know how to say, which was most things. Then Daniel Brooks looked at the house again slowly, the way a man looks at something he's been looking at for a while. "When's the last time you were out here?" he asked. 14 years, she said. He absorbed that without comment. "I didn't know it would be this bad," she admitted, and then hated herself slightly for admitting it because it sounded like weakness, and she had been trying very hard not to be weak for a very long time. Most people don't, he said. Land doesn't wait on grief. She looked at him. That was an odd thing to say, specific in a way she hadn't expected, and it landed somewhere inside her with unexpected accuracy. No, she said quietly. I suppose it doesn't. He swung down from the horse in one clean motion and stood on the ground holding the reins. He was taller than she'd estimated. He walked toward the fence line, stopped at the edge of what counted as the property boundary, and studied the nearest collapsed post with a professional kind of attention. Fence rot, he said. Been down for at least 2 winters, I'd guess. The house? He glanced at the caved-in section. Roof went in the snow last year. I saw it happen. Meant to mention it to the county, but I wasn't sure who to contact. The county didn't mention it to me, she said. No, they wouldn't. He turned to look at her, and there was something in that look, not apology, just plain acknowledgement of a fact. County's got a lot of land to track and not many reasons to hurry. Emily folded her arms across her chest and looked out over what was hers. All of this was hers. A ruined house, a dry garden, a broken fence, and a cracked well, and 14 years of accumulated silence and neglect. Hers. I don't know where to start, she said. She hadn't meant to say it out loud. It came out the way things come out when a person has been holding them too long, and the body simply decides to let go. Daniel Brooks was quiet for a moment, not the quiet of someone searching for the right thing to say, the quiet of someone who already knew. Tell me what you need, he said. It was such a simple sentence, 4 words. No flourish to it, no particular warmth, no attempt to soften what was real or promise what couldn't be promised. Just the question sitting there in the afternoon heat between them with nowhere to go, but directly into the center of the most honest moment Emily Harper had experienced in years. She stared at him. I don't know, she said finally. That's all right, he said. We can start with what you've got. He looked at the well, first walked to it, tested the stone, pressed his hand against the crack, and studied the depth of it. Well's still sound, he said. Cracks in the surround, not the shaft. Water's probably fine. He walked to the porch next and tested the boards with his boot, careful and methodical, pressing his weight gradually onto each one before trusting it. 3 were solid. 2 were not. He stepped around the bad ones without comment and looked at the front wall of the house, then the side. The standing half is structurally sound, he said. You've got a kitchen and a main room that are usable. The east wall is the problem. Roof came down on that side. He turned to her. You can live in what's standing while the rest gets rebuilt. Emily blinked. I hadn't thought that far ahead. What had you thought? She opened her mouth, closed it. What had she thought? She had thought she had imagined arriving and being home and everything being hard but possible. She had not thought about where specifically she would sleep tonight. She had not thought about whether the stove was still functional, or whether the water was clean, or whether she had any plan beyond arriving. I thought I'd figure it out when I got here, she said. Something crossed his face that might, in a different man, have been the beginning of a smile. In Daniel Brooks, it was just a slight shift of expression, a kind of recognition. That's how most people come west, he said. Did it work for you? More or less. He looked back at the house. Took 3 winters before I stopped making expensive mistakes. He glanced at her sideways. You've got some advantages. Land's already yours. You're not starting from nothing. It feels like nothing, she said. I know, he said. It won't always. She didn't know why she believed him. She had no particular reason to trust a stranger on horseback who had ridden through a broken fence to ask if she was all right. But there was something in the way Daniel Brooks said things without decoration, without the artificial comfort that people offer when they want to escape an uncomfortable situation, that made each sentence feel like something he actually meant. She was not accustomed to that. Marcus had meant well. She believed that still. But Marcus had been a man of grand intentions and soft follow-through, and the years of nursing him through sickness had taught Emily to hear the difference between what a man said and what a man would actually do when things got hard. She had become very good at hearing that difference. Daniel Brooks. She thought, watching him move around her broken porch with the careful practicality of a man who solved problems for a living, Daniel Brooks was not that kind of man. "The barn," she said, because she needed to be moving, needed to be doing something useful. "Can the barn be salvaged?" He turned toward it. "Let's look." They walked across the yard together, not touching, not particularly close, but in the easy parallel of two people who have each decided without discussing it that the task at hand matters more than the strangeness of the situation. He pulled the barn door off its rails completely. It was easier than fighting the half-on, half-off hang of it, and leaned it against the side wall. The interior was dark and smelled of old hay and dry wood and the particular dusty sadness of a place that hasn't held animals in years. "Roof is solid," Daniel said, looking up. "Someone kept it repaired at least. Beams are good, floors sound." He turned in a slow circle. "This barn is in better shape than the house." "My father loved his animals," Emily said. "He always cared for the barn first." "Good man," Daniel said again. Simply, like it was just a fact. Emily ran her hand along one of the stall walls. The wood was dry, but not rotted. She found a rusted latch still hanging on a stall door and closed the door, gently testing the hinge. It held. "I had a horse in Chicago," she said. "A neighbor's horse. I used to help with it on weekends." She paused. "That was the closest I got to this." She gestured vaguely, to all of it. The land, the barn, the life her father had lived out here alone. "Did you like it?" Daniel asked. "The horse. I liked it more than most things," she admitted. He nodded as though that was a perfectly sufficient answer. They walked the property for another hour, not talking constantly, not filling every silence, but moving through the work of understanding the land with a shared and quiet attention that Emily found, to her surprise, less exhausting than conversation. Daniel identified what needed immediate attention and what could wait. He did not overwhelm her with the scope of it. He simply moved through it systematically, the way a man does when he has looked at broken things his whole life and knows that looking is the necessary first step before fixing. The sun was dropping toward the ridgeline when they came back around to the front of the house. "You need labor," Daniel said. "2 men, maybe 3 for the roof section. It's not beyond repair. The framing is intact on that side. It's mostly the roofing material that came down. A week's work to get it weathered in. After that, you're looking at fence repair, garden preparation, well, maintenance." He paused. "I know men in town who work fair and don't overcharge a woman because she's alone." Emily looked at him steadily. "How do I know you're not one of them?" "You don't," he said. "Not yet." She almost laughed. She hadn't laughed and she couldn't remember. The almost of it surprised her. "I'll cook supper," she said. "If there's a stove still working and something to cook with, I'll feed whoever helps." She looked at him. "Including you." "That's fair," he said. "It's not charity," she said, because she needed him to understand that. "It's payment." "I know the difference," he said. He mounted up, settled into the saddle, and pulled the horse around toward the north fence line. Then he stopped and looked back at her over his shoulder. "There's a widow woman in town, Martha Ellison, who runs the dry goods store," he said. "She'll sell you fair, and not talk behind your back after. First thing tomorrow, go see her. Tell her Daniel Brooks sent you." He paused. "And Mrs. Harper, the East Room is a total loss. Don't sleep in it tonight." "I wasn't planning to," she said. The very corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. "Close enough. I'll be back in the morning," he said, "with some of the roofing nails I've got spare." And then he rode north through the gap in the fence, and the sound of the horse's hooves faded out into the cooling air of the Nevada evening. And Emily Harper stood alone in front of the ruin of her inheritance, and felt for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach something that was not entirely despair. She turned back to the house. She tested the front steps, 2 solid ones, and the board on the right, and she went inside. The kitchen was intact. The stove was cold and needed cleaning, but it was whole. There was an empty water bucket by the back door and a lamp with a little oil left in it on the table. There was a chair that had survived and a table that listed slightly to one side but held her weight when she pressed both hands down on it. She set her bag on the floor. She stood in the middle of the kitchen in the last light of the day and looked at the 4 walls around her. This was hers. Broken. Dusty. Cold now that the heat of the day was lifting. Hers. She pulled out the chair. She sat down at the tilting table. She folded her hands in front of her and looked at the cold stove and thought about the question Daniel Brooks had asked her the way he had asked it, without motive, without the particular kind of helpfulness that is actually about the helper. And she thought about the fact that she hadn't been able to answer it. Tell me what you need. She had been so long without anyone asking that question. Not Marcus, not in the way that counted. Not her aunt who had raised her with the firm conviction that need was something to be managed, not expressed. Not the women she had worked beside in Chicago, who were kind enough, but each too burdened with their own needs to take on someone else's. She didn't know, she realized, sitting alone at her dead father's listing table, whether she had ever been asked that question by anyone who actually intended to wait for the answer. She was still thinking about it when the lamp oil ran low and the kitchen filled with shadows, and she lay down on the floor with her coat folded under her head, too tired to search the house for something better, and listened to the Nevada night settle in around her, big and dark and full of silence, and thought that for the first time in a very long while, the silence didn't feel entirely empty. She was still here. The land was still here, and in the morning, a man was going to come back with roofing nails. It wasn't much, but in 1874, in the Walker Valley Basin of Nevada, with nothing to her name but a broken house and 14 years of someone else's dreams, it was Emily Harper decided enough to begin. Daniel Brooks was as good as his word. He arrived the next morning before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, and he was not alone. He brought 2 men with him, a broad, quiet Mexican named Rio, who moved like someone who had been lifting heavy things his whole life, and a younger man, barely 20, called Pete, who had the eager, slightly overwhelmed look of someone who wanted badly to prove himself useful. Daniel made the introductions briefly, the way he did most things, and then looked at Emily with the particular kind of directness that she was already beginning to recognize as his only mode of communication. "Rio knows roofing," he said. "Pete does what he's told. I'll work the east wall. You tell me if something's wrong and I'll fix it." "Good morning to you too, Mr. Brooks," Emily said. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite amusement. Close enough. "Good morning, Mrs. Harper." She had been up since before dawn. She'd cleaned the stove. It took an hour and a half and left her hands black to the wrist, and she'd hauled water from the well, and she'd gone through every inch of the kitchen and the main room with a broom she found hanging on a nail behind the back door. She'd found a tin of coffee her father had left nearly empty, and she'd made what there was of it, and she handed Daniel a cup before he had taken 3 steps through the door. He looked at it. He looked at her. He took it. "Found the dry goods store," she said. "Martha Ellison was already open when I got there this morning. She said you're either the most reliable man in the county or the most stubborn, depending on who you ask." She say which she thought. She said both at the same time. Emily handed cups to Rio and Pete as well, and Rio accepted his with a slow nod that carried more warmth than most people's words, and Pete said thank you 3 times in quick succession, and then looked embarrassed about it. "She also said to tell you the Garrett brothers were in yesterday asking about this property." Daniel went still. It was a particular kind of stillness. Not surprise, not alarm, but the stillness of a man who has heard a name he expected to hear eventually and is now deciding what to do about it. "What did they want?" he said. She didn't know exactly. Asked if anyone had claimed the Harper land. Asked how long the county would hold it before opening it up. Emily kept her voice even. She said they've been eyeing this stretch of valley for 2 seasons. Daniel set his coffee cup on the table. He looked at the wall for a moment, not at anything on the wall, just at the wall itself, the way people look when they're thinking something through. "The Garrett brothers," he said, "run cattle on the south end of the valley. They've been pushing for more grazing land since the railroad survey came through last spring. Railroad survey, Emily repeated. He looked at her then. There's a corridor being planned. Stage 1 may be 2 years out. Land along the route is worth considerably more than land that isn't. He paused. Your father's property sits on what might be the edge of that corridor. Might be inside it, depending on the final survey. Emily felt the implications of that land quietly in her chest. They were hoping no one would come. They were hoping the county would release it as unclaimed, Daniel said. That's different from hoping. Is it? He considered that. Barely, he admitted. It was the first time Emily had seen him concede a point, and something about the honesty of it, the willingness to say, barely when barely was the truth, steadied her in a way she hadn't expected. She'd met men who argued every corner. She'd met men who smiled and agreed with everything she said and meant none of it. Daniel Brooks, she was learning, did neither. What do I need to do? She said. File your occupancy with the county clerk today, not tomorrow, today. Get your presence on record and your improvements documented. He picked up his coffee again. I'll go with you if you want a witness to the filing. Clerks pay more attention when there's a witness. She looked at him. You have a lot to do here already. I do, he said. Come on, let's get started on the roof first. We'll ride to town this afternoon. She almost argued. She caught herself and stopped and recognized that what she was about to argue against was help, actual practical no-strings help, and that her instinct to push it away said more about her last 3 years than it did about any reasonable assessment of the situation. All right, she said. The roof first. Rio and Pete were already outside. The sound of boots on the remaining porch boards, the creak of weight testing structure, the short exchange of technical observations in a mix of English and Spanish. It came through the walls, like proof that something was actually happening, and Emily stood in her kitchen and let herself feel the reality of it. People were working on her property. Her property was being worked on. She put on her coat and went outside to help. Daniel looked at her when she appeared beside the barn, with a pile of debris she'd already started clearing from the east side. You don't have to do that, he said. I know, she said, and kept working. He watched her for exactly 2 seconds. Then he went back to what he was doing. By mid-morning, they had cleared the collapsed roofing material from the east bedroom, and Rio had assessed the framing with the quiet authority of a man who has rebuilt more things than he can count. The news was better than expected. The main beam had held the side beams needed sistering, but not replacing, and the roof could be made weathertight in 2 days if the materials arrived on time. Pete had found a weakness in the south fence line that neither of them had noticed on the walkthrough, and he reported it to Daniel with the barely contained pride of someone who has just done something useful for the first time. Good eye, Daniel told him, and Pete straightened 2 inches. Emily watched that small exchange from across the yard and thought about the particular economy of praise, how some men hoarded it like currency too valuable to spend, and how the right word at the right moment cost nothing and bought everything. She thought of Marcus again. She pushed the thought aside. Mrs. Harper. She turned. Rio was standing a few feet away, hat in hand, and he looked at her with a steadiness that reminded her somehow of Daniel, that same quality of meeting a person without excess. The kitchen wall on the east side, he said. There is a crack that runs from the window frame to the corner. It is not structural, but it will let in water when the rains come. I can patch it while I am here if you have lime. I don't, she said. Not yet. I have some at my place, he said. I will bring it tomorrow. She looked at him. What do you want for it? He shook his head once. Daniel vouches for you, he said simply, and went back to work. Emily stood there for a moment after he left, turning that sentence over. Daniel vouches for you. She hadn't asked Daniel to vouch for her. She hadn't asked for any of this. And yet, here was a man she'd never met offering to bring materials from his own supply because someone he trusted had decided she was worth trusting. She didn't know what to do with that. She went back to work because work was the only thing she currently knew how to do. They rode to town in the early afternoon, Daniel on his horse, and Emily on the hired mare she'd kept on from the livery. The county clerk's office was a small building on the main street of Millhaven that smelled of paper and ink and old wood, and the clerk himself was a thin man named Holt, with sharp eyes and the particular wariness of someone who had spent years watching people try to get things they weren't entitled to. He looked at Emily's documents. He looked at Daniel. He looked at Emily again. "You planning to work this land yourself?" he said. "Or looking to sell?" "Work it," Emily said. "That's a considerable undertaking for," he began. "For a woman," Emily said. Her voice was entirely pleasant. "Or for a person with limited capital and a great deal of labor ahead of them." Holt paused. "I was going to say for someone newly arrived." "I see," Emily said. "Then yes, it's considerable. I'd like to file the occupancy record today, please." Daniel said nothing during the entire exchange. He stood slightly to Emily's left present without crowding, and he watched Holt with the same quiet attention he applied to everything. And Emily understood without being told that his presence there was doing something specific, not speaking for her, not overriding her, but serving notice. That she was not alone in this. That there was someone paying attention to how she was treated. When Holt stamped the filing and handed her the copy, Daniel nodded once at the man's civil firm, and they walked back out into the street. "You didn't have to say anything," Emily said. "I didn't," he agreed. "But you wanted to." He considered this seriously the way he considered most things. "Holt's a fair enough man," he said. "He just needs to know when to be careful." Emily almost smiled. "And you being there made him careful?" Apparently. They stopped at Martha Ellison's store on the way back. Emily needed to price out roofing materials and garden seed and a few basic supplies, and Martha met her with the frank businesslike warmth of a woman who had no time for pretense, but a genuine interest in competence. She walked Emily through the inventory herself, answered questions without condescension, and when Emily made her selections with the particular careful precision of someone accounting for every cent, Martha watched and didn't comment on it, which was its own kind of respect. At the door, Martha pulled Emily aside quietly while Daniel was loading the goods into the saddlebags outside. "The Garrett brothers were back this morning," she said. "Both of them. Asked me directly if I knew who'd claimed the Harper land." Emily went still. "What did you tell them?" "I told them it was claimed and documented and none of their business." Martha looked at her steadily. "Cole Garrett is not a man who takes no for an answer, Mrs. Harper. He has money and he has patience, and he has a way of making things inconvenient for people who are in his way." "I appreciate the warning," Emily said. "It's not a warning," Martha said. "It's information. There's a difference." She paused. "You seem like a woman who prefers information." Emily looked at her. "I do," she said. "Good. Then also know this: you have a better friend in Daniel Brooks than most people know. He doesn't give his word cheap, and he doesn't give his time cheap. If he's working your roof, he means something by it." Emily didn't answer that. She said thank you and meant it, and walked back out into the bright afternoon. On the ride back, she was quiet longer than usual, turning everything over, the filing, the Garrett brothers, what Martha had said. Daniel rode beside her, without pushing the silence the way he'd ridden beside her through the morning's work. "Tell me about Cole Garrett," she said finally. Daniel was quiet for a moment. "He owns the Garrett Cattle Company, southern end of the valley. He's been in the county for 12 years, and he's made money steadily, mostly fair. Mostly." He paused on that word with intention. He had his eye on 3 separate parcels in the last 4 years. 2 of them he got. One of them, the Reyes family over by the eastern draw, he didn't get, and he made the next 6 months very difficult for them. How? Diverted irrigation, blocked road access with his cattle during calving season, filed a nuisance complaint with the county over a fence line that had been fined for 10 years. Daniel glanced at her. "Nothing violent. Cole Garrett isn't a violent man. He's a patient one. That's sometimes worse." Emily let that settle. "He's going to come to me directly," she said. It wasn't a question. "Most likely," Daniel said. "And he'll make an offer. And it will be lower than the land is worth. And he'll make sure you know how hard the next few years will be if you try to hold it alone." Emily looked at the road ahead. "I'm not alone," she said. She hadn't meant it the way it landed. She'd meant it practically. She had Rio and Pete and Martha and Daniel. But when she heard the words in the air between them, they sounded like something different. Larger. More specific. Daniel didn't respond for a moment. "No," he said finally, "you're not." They were back at the homestead by late afternoon, and Rio and Pete had made visible progress on the east wall. The collapsed material was fully cleared, the framing exposed and assessed, the first sistering beam already in place. Pete was on the roof with a hammer and the particular focused terror of someone working at height for the first time, and Rio was below him calling instructions with the patience of a man who has trained a dozen Petes in his lifetime. Emily paid them both for the day. Fair wages the same she would pay a man. She handed the money directly, and Rio took it with a nod, and Pete looked at the coins in his palm like they were proof of something. "Same time tomorrow?" Pete asked. "Same time," Emily said. When they'd ridden off, it was just Daniel finishing the east wall, framing the sound of his hammer steady and unhurried in the cooling air. Emily brought him water. He stopped, drank it, handed the cup back. "You're not going to run," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "No," she said. "Even knowing about Garrett." "Especially knowing about Garrett," she said. "If I run now, I'll spend the rest of my life wondering if I could have stayed." She looked at the half-repaired wall. "I've already spent too long doing that." He looked at her directly the way he always did, without the pretense of not seeing what he was seeing. "What did you leave behind?" he said. "In Chicago." It was the most personal thing he'd asked her. She felt it arrive that way, not invasive, just honest, an open door. "A husband I nursed for 2 years," she said. "A life that was built around someone else's needs for long enough that I stopped knowing my own." She met his gaze. "And the habit of being invisible." Something moved through his expression. "You're not invisible," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm learning that again." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was strictly practical, and in that moment, Emily Harper felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time, the particular startling sensation of being actually seen by another person, not pitied, not managed, not assessed for her usefulness or her vulnerability, just seen. Then he looked back at the wall. He picked up his hammer. "Framing'll be done tomorrow," he said. "Roofing nails are going to hold. The east room could be livable by end of the week." "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Garrett's going to show up before the week is out. That's when the real work starts." Emily looked out over her land. Still cracked, still dry, still far from what it needed to be, but moving now, changing, now breathing again, in the particular slow way that things breathe when someone has decided to fight for them. She was not afraid of Cole Garrett. She was not afraid of anything she realized that was made of patience and money, and the quiet assumption that a woman alone would eventually give up. She had been a woman alone before. She had outlasted harder things than a patient man with deep pockets. She went back inside and started supper, and the sound of Daniel's hammer continued steady outside until the last of the light was gone from the sky. Cole Garrett came on a Thursday. Emily heard the horses, first 2 of them moving at the unhurried pace of men who have never had a reason to hurry because the world has always waited for them. She was in the kitchen going over the ledger she'd started keeping, every expense and every repair, and every dollar accounted for in the small, precise handwriting that her aunt had drilled into her as a girl. She closed the ledger before she went to the door. She wasn't sure why. Some instinct about not showing certain men what you're counting. There were 2 of them. Cole Garrett was the older one, 50, maybe silver-haired, well-dressed for a man riding out to a work property, which told her immediately that this was not a casual visit. He had the kind of face that had once been handsome and had cured into something harder and more certain of itself. The man beside him was younger, heavier, and wore his hat pulled low in the particular way of someone who wants to be slightly difficult to read. Cole Garrett smiled when he saw her. It was a good smile, practiced. "Mrs. Harper," he said. I'm Cole Garrett. I run cattle on the south end of the valley. I believe we're neighbors." "I know who you are," Emily said. She stayed in the doorway. She did not invite him in. Something flickered behind his eyes just for a moment, and then the smile held. "Then you may know I've had an interest in this stretch of land for some time. I was sorry to hear about your father. Thomas Harper was a decent man." "He was," she said. "I won't waste your time," Garrett said, and Emily thought that's exactly what you're about to do. "I'd like to make you an offer on the property. Fair market value, possibly above it, given the complications involved in bringing this land back to productivity." He named a number. It was not a bad number. That was the thing. It was not a bad number, and he knew it wasn't, and he was watching her with the particular attention of a man who has made this kind of offer before, and knows what a woman alone on hard land looks like when she's calculating survival. "That's a fair number," Emily said. Garrett relaxed slightly, almost imperceptibly, but she caught it. "For land with no improvements and no water access," she continued. "This land has a functioning well, a repaired barn, a house under active reconstruction, and county occupancy filed as of 3 days ago." She looked at him steadily. "The number you want is different from the number I'd consider." The smile didn't leave his face, but it stopped reaching his eyes. "You've been busy," he said. "I have," she said. "How long have you been in Nevada?" "Mrs. Harper, a week. Long enough to file," she said. "Which is all the law requires." Garrett shifted in the saddle. He glanced at the east wall of the house, repaired, now roofed sound, and at the barn, and at the fence line that Rio and Pete had spent 2 days straightening and resetting. She watched him take inventory of every improvement and understand what it meant, which was that she had not arrived here helpless, and she had not stayed that way. "The railroad corridor," he said then, directly, dropping the pleasantries. "What about it?" she said. "If the survey comes through where they're projecting this property line sits at the northern edge of the access route. That makes it valuable in a way that has nothing to do with cattle or crops." He leaned forward slightly. "A woman in your position, newly arrived, capital limited, no established operation, would be taking on years of hard work for a payout that might not come until the railroad does. Whereas I can give you that payout now, today, in cash. Or," Emily said, "I could wait for the railroad survey to finalize, establish my improvements on record, and sell at the actual corridor-adjusted value when the time comes." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. This was not the conversation he had planned. "You've done your research," he said. "Martha Ellison is an excellent source of county information," Emily said pleasantly. "And the county clerk's office keeps very thorough records." The younger man shifted on his horse. Garrett held perfectly still. "I'll come back," he said, "when you've had more time to think." "I'll be here," Emily said. She watched them ride south until the sound of the horses faded out entirely. Then she went back inside, sat down at the table, opened the ledger, and stared at the numbers for a full minute without seeing them, because her hands were shaking slightly, and she needed them to stop before she could write anything. She had not been afraid. She wanted to be clear about that even in her own mind. She had not been afraid of Cole Garrett. But she had been something, the particular heightened alertness of a person who has just held a line they weren't entirely sure they could hold. And the aftermath of it moved through her system like cold water. She was still sitting there when she heard a horse in the yard. Daniel came through the door without knocking. They'd stopped observing that particular formality sometime in the second week, and he took one look at her face and said, "Garrett." And someone else, younger. He didn't introduce him. "That's his nephew Wade. He brings him when he wants to seem like less of a threat." Daniel came to the table and sat across from her. What did he offer? She told him. She told him all of it. The number, the railroad corridor comment, the specific framing of her as a woman alone with capital limitations. She recounted it the way she'd always been good at recounting things precisely and in order, and Daniel listened the whole way through without interrupting. When she finished, he said, "You held him off. For now. That's not nothing. Cole Garrett expected to have this conversation once." He looked at her. He didn't expect you to know about the corridor. I shouldn't have let him know that I knew, Emily said. It was a mistake. Now he knows what I'm thinking, and he has time to adjust. Daniel was quiet for a moment. Or it tells him you're not going to be easy, he said. And that matters too. He paused. Did he threaten anything? Nothing direct. He's too careful for direct. She closed the ledger. You were right. Patient men are harder than angry ones. You're not wrong. He was watching her with that steady attention of his. Are you scared? The question arrived so plainly that she almost laughed. I was, she admitted. My hands were shaking after he left. That's not fear, he said. That's your body burning off something it had to hold very still for a few minutes. She looked at him. You know that feeling. I grew up working for men like Garrett, he said. Quiet. Even. The first thing he'd said about himself that was actually about himself. Before I had my own operation, I worked 3 ranches where the man at the top believed that patience was the same thing as ownership, that if he waited long enough a thing would come to him. He picked up her cup of cold coffee from the table, the one she'd forgotten she'd made, and turned it in his hands. I left the 3rd one after he tried it on me. What did he try? Told me he owned my labor contract and I couldn't leave until the term was done. Contract he'd written himself, terms I'd never agreed to. His jaw tightened slightly. I left anyway. He threatened to take me to court. I told him to do it, and I found a lawyer in Carson City who told me the contract wasn't enforceable, and that was the end of it. Emily stared at him. How old were you? 22. And you weren't afraid. He considered this honestly. I was terrified, he said. But being terrified and staying anyway is the only kind of courage that's ever meant anything to me. She looked at him across the table. This man who had come back every morning for 3 weeks with tools and labor and practical steadiness, who vouched for her to strangers and stood beside her in county offices and never once made her feel like his help was a debt she owed. She looked at him and thought, I do not know how to account for you. Daniel, she said. Why are you here? Still, not today specifically, in general. She kept her voice level because the question mattered, and she didn't want it to sound like anything other than what it was. You have your own operation, you have your own labor, and your own problems. You come here every day. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. He set the cup down. Your father, he said. The last 2 winters he was alive. He was already sick, though I didn't know how sick. He'd come to the fence line some mornings, and we'd talk while I was checking cattle. Not about much. Weather. Land. How his garden was doing. He paused. He told me about you. Talked about you like you were still 12 years old, even though he knew you weren't. He said she's coming back someday. She doesn't know it yet, but she's coming back. Emily felt something break open quietly inside her chest. He never told me he thought about me, she said. He thought about you constantly, Daniel said. I think the loneliness of the last few years was mostly about waiting for you to come back. He met her gaze. When I found you on your knees in the yard, I wasn't a stranger helping a widow. I was keeping a promise to an old man who talked about his daughter like she was the best thing he'd ever done. She didn't trust her voice for a moment. She pressed her hands flat on the table and breathed through it, and when she spoke, her voice was steady. Why didn't you tell me that from the beginning? Because you needed help, he said. Not a story. The winter gathering in Mill Haven came in late November. Martha Ellison organized it. She organized most things in Millhaven, which she did with the cheerful iron will of a woman who understood that if she didn't, nothing would get done. It was held in the church hall, which was the largest space in town, and the whole valley came ranchers and their families, the town merchants, the Mexican workers who had built half the county's infrastructure, and were beginning slowly to be treated with something approaching the respect they were owed. Pete came and spent most of the evening talking very earnestly to a girl from the Ellison store. Rio came with his wife and 3 children and stood at the edge of things with the quiet dignity of a man who doesn't need to be at the center to belong. Emily wore the green dress she had brought from Chicago. It was 3 years old, and she had let the hem down an inch to account for a fashion change, and it was the nicest thing she owned, which was not saying much. Martha told her she looked wonderful. Emily told her she was being kind. Martha told her she was being accurate, and there was a difference, and then she moved on to organize something else. Daniel found her an hour into the evening. He was wearing a clean jacket that Emily had never seen before, and he looked exactly like himself, which is to say, he looked more like himself than most men managed in their best clothes, which was not comfortable in their formal wear, but stood in it like it was something to be gotten through. He found her near the back wall where she'd retreated slightly from the noise, and he stood beside her without preamble or ceremony. "You look well," he said. "You sound surprised," she said. "I'm not surprised," he said. "I just don't say it enough." Emily looked at him sideways. That was different. That was not his usual plain-spoken practicality. That was something else. "Daniel." "You just said something that wasn't about fences or water access." The corner of his mouth moved. "I say things that aren't about fences." "Rarely," she said. He looked out at the room. "I reckon that's fair," he said. And then, still looking at the room, still not looking at her, he said, "I think about you more than is strictly necessary for a neighbor." The hall noise continued around them. Someone was playing a fiddle on the far side. 2 children were chasing each other between adult legs. The world kept going ordinary and loud, and Emily Harper stood beside Daniel Brooks and felt the sentence land in her like a struck match. "How often?" she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Often enough that I know when your lamp is still lit at 10 at night," he said. "Often enough that I find reasons to come by that aren't strictly about the roof or the fences." He turned and looked at her then, directly. The way he always did, except that now the directness had something in it she hadn't seen before. Not vulnerability exactly, but the careful bravery of a man saying a true thing he knows cannot be unsaid. "I'm not a man who talks around things well. I never have been. But I'd rather say it plain and wrong than not say it at all." Emily looked at him for a long moment. Her heart was doing something complicated. "I think about you too," she said. "More than I expected. More than I've thought about anyone in a very long time." He held her gaze. And I don't know what to do with it," she said honestly. "I came out here to build something of my own. A life that belongs to me that I built with my own hands. I didn't come out here to need someone." "There's a difference," he said quietly, "between needing someone and wanting them." She stared at him. "I'm not asking you to need me," he said. "I'm not interested in being needed. I watched what that does to people, and it doesn't end well for either of them." His voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something careful and honest and a little raw, the sound of a man who has thought about this longer than this moment. "But I am asking if there's something here worth being honest about. I'd rather be honest." Emily looked away from him out at the room, at Pete and his girl, at Rio's children, at Martha Ellison commanding the refreshment table with absolute authority, at all the ordinary life of the valley moving around her. "I was invisible for 6 years," she said. "In Chicago, in my marriage, in the boarding house. I was a function, a caretaker, a widow. I had forgotten what it felt like to be a person that someone actually saw." "I see you," he said. "I know," she said. "That's what I don't know how to handle." They stood together in the noise and warmth of the hall, and neither of them said anything more for a while, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of 2 people who have said something real and are letting it exist between them without rushing to cover it with more words. Then Emily said, "Ask me again in the spring." He looked at her. "When the East Room is finished," she said. "When the garden is planted. When I know whether I can make this work on my own terms." She met his gaze. "Ask me in the spring, when the answer I give you is free." Daniel Brooks looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face. Something that was not disappointment and was not resignation, but was a kind of recognition. The particular recognition of a patient man who understands that the right thing asked at the wrong time is not courage, it's just impatience, dressed up as feeling. "All right," he said. "All right," she said. They stood together for the rest of the evening, not as anything declared or defined, but as two people occupying the same space with the particular ease of shared understanding. And when the gathering ended and the cold November air hit them outside, Daniel helped Emily onto her horse and then mounted his own, and they rode north together through the dark valley without speaking. At the fork where the road split his property north, hers east, he stopped. "The Garrett survey results come back in March," he said. "Whatever they show, we deal with it." "Together," she said. He met her eyes. "You said ask you in the spring." "I did," she said. "Then I'll be there in the spring," he said. And he turned north and rode into the dark, and Emily rode east toward the lamp she'd left burning in the kitchen window, and the cold Nevada air pressed around her on all sides. And for the first time since she had arrived in this valley, with nothing she understood the difference between being alone and being lonely. She was alone. She was not in any way that mattered lonely. The east room was almost finished. The garden was waiting. Spring was 3 months away. She could wait 3 months. March came in cold and then turned warm in the space of a single week, the way Nevada springs do without apology or gradual warning. Just a shift in the air, and suddenly, the ground was breathing again. The railroad survey results arrived on a Tuesday. Emily was at the county clerk's office when they did, which was not a coincidence. She had been checking in with Holt every week since January, politely and consistently, until he had stopped looking at her with wariness and started looking at her with something closer to resignation, and then eventually something closer to respect. She was there when the courier came in from Carson City with the territorial surveyor's report, and she watched Holt open the document with the particular controlled calm of a woman who has been waiting 3 months for a piece of paper and has rehearsed every possible outcome. Holt read it. He looked up at her. He looked back down at it. "Your property line," he said carefully, "sits 400 yards inside the northern boundary of the designated corridor." Emily felt the number land in her chest like a stone dropped in still water. 400 yards. Not on the edge. Inside it. "How wide is the designated corridor?" she said. 800 yards on either side of the projected center line. Holt set the document down and folded his hands on it with the careful deliberateness of a man who understands he is holding something significant. "Mrs. Harper, I'll be plain with you. This land is now worth approximately 4 times what it was worth 6 months ago." She looked at him steadily. "And Cole Garrett knows this." "The survey results are a public record," he said. "Which means yes, within the day." Emily thanked him. She walked out of the clerk's office into the bright March morning and stood on the boardwalk and thought with the precise, urgent focus she had been developing since the day she arrived. What does he do next? She didn't go home. She went to Martha Ellison's store. Martha read the situation on her face before Emily said a word. She came around the counter, turned the store sign to closed, and said, "Sit down and tell me everything," Emily told her. All of it. The survey results, the corridor designation, the math on what the land was now worth. Martha listened without interruption, which was unusual for Martha, and when Emily finished, Martha sat back and said, "He's going to move fast." "I know. He has friends on the county commission," Martha said. "Not corrupt friends exactly, just friends who owe him things. He's going to file something. A dispute, a competing claim, some nuisance argument that creates enough legal uncertainty to slow down any sale or development agreement you might pursue." "What kind of competing claim can he file?" Emily said. "The deed is clean. The occupancy is filed. The title is in my name." "He doesn't need to win," Martha said. "He just needs to tie it up long enough that you run out of money maintaining the property while it sits under dispute. Then he makes a lower offer when you're desperate." She paused. "It's what he did to the Reyes family." Emily was quiet for a moment. What did the Reyes family not have that stopped them from fighting it? "Documentation," Martha said. "They'd made improvements, but informally. Nothing filed, nothing witnessed, nothing on record at the county. Garrett's lawyer argued the improvements were insufficient to establish productive occupancy under territorial law. "My improvements are documented," Emily said slowly. "I started the ledger the first week. Every repair, every material, every labor dollar, every date." Martha looked at her. "How thorough." "Very," Emily said. "I was a bookkeeper's wife for 4 years. Marcus managed accounts for a shipping firm. I kept his books when he was too sick to do it himself." She met Martha's eyes. "I know what documentation looks like when it's meant to hold up." Martha Ellison stared at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Emily Harper, you have been sitting on that ledger for 3 months, and you didn't think to mention it. I didn't know it was going to matter this way." "It matters every way." Martha stood up. "You need a lawyer. There's a man in Elko named Thomas Patterson who handled the Hendricks land dispute last fall and won it cleanly. He's expensive, but he's honest, and he knows territorial law better than anyone in the county." She was already moving toward the back room. "I'm going to write you a letter of introduction. You go to Elko tomorrow." "Martha." "Tomorrow," Martha said firmly. "Before Garrett files anything." Emily went to Elko the next morning. She brought the ledger. Thomas Patterson was a lean, sharp-eyed man in his 40s who had the particular quality of a lawyer who has stopped being impressed by anything, which meant when something impressed him, it showed clearly. He opened the ledger Emily handed him across the desk, and she watched his eyes move down the first page, and then the second, and then he looked up at her. "You prepared this yourself," he said. "Yes." Every entry dated, witnessed where applicable, and cross-referenced to the county filing dates. He turned another page. "Mrs. Harper, this is meticulous." "I had good reason to be careful," she said. He read for 10 more minutes without speaking. Then he closed the ledger and set his hands on top of it. "Garrett hasn't filed anything yet," he said. "I checked this morning. If we move today, we can establish your productive occupancy on record before any competing claim is introduced, and we can do it in a way that forecloses most of his available arguments." He paused. "The ledger is your strongest evidence. May I keep it for 24 hours? "You may," she said. "I have a copy." Patterson blinked. "You made a copy?" "I made 2, Emily said. "One is at the property, one is with Martha Ellison in Millhaven." The lawyer looked at her with the expression of a man reassessing something entirely. "How long have you been planning for this?" he said. Emily thought about the first morning in the kitchen, the cold stove, and the tilting table, and the lamp burning low. She thought about the ledger she'd started on day 3, because it was the only habit she had that made chaos feel manageable. "Since the beginning," she said, "I just didn't know what I was planning for." She rode back to Millhaven in the late afternoon, with Patterson's assurance that the filing would be complete by end of business the next day. She was 2 miles from home when she saw Daniel's horse tied to the front post. He was inside, standing in the kitchen. He turned when she came through the door, and she could read his face, which she had gotten very good at reading, and she could see that he already knew about the survey results, and was trying to decide how to handle what he knew. "Patterson and Elko," she said before he could speak. "He's filing tomorrow. Ledger goes into evidence. Garrett's window closes by Thursday." Daniel looked at her. Something in his face shifted from controlled concern to something she hadn't seen there before, a kind of pure, uncomplicated relief. "You all ready?" he started. "Went to Martha this morning, rode to Elko, came back." She set her bag on the table. "I've been keeping the ledger since the first week. Every improvement, every dollar, every date. Patterson says it's the strongest occupancy evidence he's seen in 5 years of land cases." Daniel sat down. He was silent for a moment, in the way he was silent when he was actually absorbing something rather than formulating a response. "I was going to offer to ride with you," he said. "I know," she said. "But you'd already gone." "I'd already gone," she said. She looked at him steadily. "I didn't need you to go with me, Daniel. I needed to go myself." He looked up at her. "I know that," he said. "And then, I'm proud of you." 3 words. Plain and direct, the way he said everything. Emily felt them arrive somewhere deep in her chest and stay there. "Thank you," she said quietly. Cole Garrett came the following Friday. This time he came alone, which was a different kind of statement than the last time. No nephew, no display of numbers. He tied his horse at the post and came to the door, and when Emily opened it, he looked at her with an expression that had shed all of its practiced pleasantness and become simply the face of a man doing arithmetic. "Patterson filed," he said. "He did," Emily said. "The ledger evidence is strong," Garrett said. It was not a compliment. It was an acknowledgement. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "My lawyer says we have two arguable avenues, the survey boundary measurement and the water rights classification." He watched her face as he said it. Emily kept her expression entirely level. She had spent the previous 2 days with Patterson going over exactly those two avenues in detail. She knew the survey boundary measurement question had been resolved in an 1871 territorial decision that established the county surveyor's determination as final absent of federal challenge. She knew the water rights classification on the Harper well predated Garrett's own operation by 11 years and was registered at the territorial level. "Mr. Garrett," she said, "before you pay your lawyer to pursue two arguments that won't succeed, I want to make sure you have accurate information." She told him briefly and specifically exactly why each of his two arguable avenues would fail. She cited the 1871 decision. She gave him the water rights registration date. She watched his face. He listened to all of it without speaking. "Where did you learn land law?" he said when she finished. "I asked the right questions of the right people," she said. "And I read everything I was given." She paused. "I also spent 4 years managing my late husband's business accounts. Numbers are not a mystery to me, Mr. Garrett. They are a language. And the numbers on this property tell a very clear story." Garrett looked at her for a long moment. The arithmetic behind his eyes was visible. The calculation of time, money, legal cost, probable outcome, and she watched him arrive at the number that she had already arrived at 3 days ago. "What do you want?" he said finally. "I want to be left alone to work my land," she said. "That's all I've ever wanted." He nodded once, slowly. "And if the railroad wants to negotiate an access easement through the northern edge of your property, then they negotiate with me directly," she said, "at fair market rate. You deal with the railroad yourself." "I would." She met his gaze. "I have a lawyer. I have documentation, and I have time, Mr. Garrett. I'm 26 years old. I have a great deal of time." Cole Garrett looked at her for another long moment. Then he did something she had not expected. He almost smiled, not the practiced smile from the first visit, but something smaller and more genuine, the expression of a man who has met an adversary he didn't anticipate and is deciding whether to be angry about it or simply accept it. "You're not what I expected," he said. "No," Emily said. "I'm not." He untied his horse. He mounted up. He looked back at her once from the saddle. "Thomas Harper would have been proud of you," he said. And then he rode south and did not come back. Emily stood in the doorway for a long moment after the sound of the hooves faded. Her hands were not shaking this time. There was no aftermath of held tension moving through her system. There was just clarity. The clean, quiet feeling of a thing completed. She went inside. She put the kettle on. She sat down at the table and opened the ledger and looked at the numbers she had kept so carefully since the beginning, and she thought, "I did this. This is mine." When Daniel came the next morning, she told him everything. He listened the way he always listened, fully, without comment, letting her tell it in her own order and her own words. When she finished, he looked at her for a moment. "Garrett backed down," he said. "Garrett ran out of arguments," she said. "Same thing," he said. And then, "Emily." She looked at him. He had used her first name exactly 3 times since she'd arrived in Nevada. She had counted. "You said ask you in the spring," he said. The kitchen was warm. Outside, the first week of April was doing what it was supposed to do. She had been waiting for this moment for 3 months, and now that it was here, she found that she was not nervous. She was not uncertain. She was exactly what she had told him she wanted to be when she gave the answer free. "I love you," she said, before he could ask, before he could formulate the question into his careful, plain-spoken sentence. She said it first because it was true, and she was done waiting for the right moment when the right moment was right now. "Not because I need someone, not because you helped me, because you are exactly who you are, and who you are is something I want beside me." Daniel Brooks looked at her across the table. Something moved through his face that she had never seen there before, not the controlled attention, or the quiet amusement, or the careful plain-spokenness, something raw and more open. The face of a man who has been waiting for something long enough that he stopped letting himself expect it. "I love you too," he said. "I have for longer than is probably reasonable given the timeline." She laughed. Actually laughed, not the almost of the first week, but a full, real, unguarded laugh. "How long?" "Since you told Cole Garrett you knew who he was and didn't invite him inside," he said. She laughed again. He watched her laugh with the expression of a man who has just done something exactly right and knows it. They were married in June of 1875, not in the church. Emily had never been a church in the formal sense kind of woman, and Daniel had even less interest in ceremony than she did. But in the yard of the homestead, in front of the repaired house and the sound barn, and the garden that had come in better than anyone had predicted, with Martha Ellison as witness, and Rio and his family, and Pete, who cried briefly and then was very embarrassed about it. The judge from Millhaven came out and read the words, and Daniel put the ring on Emily's hand with the same steady deliberateness he brought to every physical task. And she looked up at him when it was done. And he looked at her, and what passed between them in that moment needed no ceremony and no witness and no words. It was simply the look of two people who have built something real and know it. That evening, after everyone had gone, they sat on the repaired porch, the boards solid, now the posts straight, and Emily leaned her shoulder against his and looked out at the land that was hers and his and theirs, and said nothing, and he said nothing. And the Nevada evening settled around them with the particular fullness of a place that has been brought back from the edge of being lost and has decided to stay. "What do you need?" he said. It was the first time he had asked it since the beginning. She heard the echo of it, the dust, the broken fence, the first bewildering day when she hadn't known how to answer. She knew how to answer now. "This," she said. "Exactly this." He put his arm around her shoulders. She let him. And the homestead alive and real, and theirs breathed quietly around them in the last light of the day. The first winter they were married, the snow came early and stayed long, and the Harper Brooks homestead held against it in a way the old place never could have. That was the first thing Emily noticed about being married to Daniel. Not the companionship, not the warmth of another person in the house, not even the particular comfort of waking up and knowing someone was there. It was the way the house itself seemed to settle more firmly into the ground. Like it had decided to stay. Like it had been waiting for enough people inside it to make that decision worth making. They worked the land through that first winter with the disciplined patience of two people who know what they're working toward. Daniel managed the cattle operation from his northern property and the Harper land, both running them as a single enterprise that was more efficient than either had been separately. Emily ran the accounts, all of them both properties, with the same meticulous precision she'd applied to the ledger that had stopped Cole Garrett cold. She knew to the dollar what they were worth, what they owed, what they needed to grow, and in what order. Daniel would come in at the end of a workday, pull off his boots at the door, and sit down at the table where she was working and say, "Tell me where we are." And she would tell him. Not a summary, the actual numbers, the actual picture. And he would listen with the same full attention he'd given everything she'd ever said. And then they would talk about it. Not him deciding and her agreeing, but both of them arriving at a conclusion together. And then he would say, "All right, what do you need to make that happen?" And she would tell him that too. It was the most honest conversation she had ever had with another person. Every night about money and land and cattle and futures. And woven into the plain-spokenness of it was something neither of them said outright, but both of them understood this is what it looks like when two people actually trust each other. Their first child was born in the spring of 1877, A girl. They named her Clara after no one in particular, just because when Emily looked at her daughter's face, for the first time, the name arrived fully formed, the way certain things do when they're simply right. Clara was born loud and opinionated, and Daniel looked at her in Emily's arms and said, "She's going to be a handful." And Emily said good and meant it entirely. The boy came 2 years later. Thomas for Emily's father. He had Daniel's stillness and Emily's precision, and the particular combination of those two qualities produced a child who was frightening to play checkers against before he was 7 years old. Pete, who had become a permanent hand on the operation, by then lost to Thomas 4 times in a row one afternoon and was genuinely unsettled by it. "That boy ain't right," Pete told Daniel. "He's exactly right," Daniel said, and went back to work. The homestead expanded slowly and on purpose. Emily never let them grow faster than they could sustain, which sometimes frustrated Daniel, who had the rancher's instinct for more land, more cattle, more reach, and led to the only real arguments of their marriage, which were conducted plainly and resolved plainly and left neither of them with anything unfinished between them. "We can afford the north pasture," Daniel said one evening in 1879, pushing a price quote across the table. Emily looked at it. "We can afford the payment," she said. "We cannot afford the payment and a bad cattle season in the same year. The season's been good 3 years running." "The season's been good 3 years running," she agreed, "which means we are 3 years closer to a bad one." She turned the paper around and wrote a number on the back. "This is what I'd offer. If he takes it, we can absorb a bad year. If he doesn't, we wait." Daniel looked at the number. He looked at her. He pushed back his chair and went outside, and she heard his boots on the porch, and she let him be, because she knew by then the difference between Daniel needing time and Daniel being angry. He came back inside 20 minutes later. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said. "Make the offer." He almost smiled. "Yes, ma'am." The seller took it. The north pasture became theirs. And the following year, when a drought cut the valley's grazing capacity by a third and 2 neighboring operations had to sell stock at a loss to cover debt, the Brooks Ranch held exactly as Emily had calculated it would. Daniel told Rio about it one morning while they were working fence. Rio had been listening to Emily's quarterly account reports at the kitchen table for 4 years. By then, Daniel had started including him in those meetings early on out of respect for what Rio had built alongside them, and he shook his head slowly. "She sees things before they happen," Rio said. "She doesn't see the future," Daniel said. "She just looks at the numbers honestly. Most people don't." "Why not?" Daniel thought about it. "Because looking at numbers honestly means knowing things you'd sometimes rather not know." He stretched a wire taut. "Emily doesn't look away from things." It was the most accurate description of his wife he ever gave, and he gave it to a man hammering fence posts at 7 in the morning, which was exactly the kind of situation where the truest things tend to get said. The literacy classes started in 1880, the year Clara turned 3. It began with Martha Ellison's younger sister, who had come west from Ohio, and discovered that the women in the county had been managing without reading for so long that most of them had stopped noticing it as an absence. She came to Emily because Martha had told her to, and Emily had said yes before she finished asking, because the answer to that question had always been yes, she'd just been waiting for someone to ask it. They started with 4 women around the kitchen table on Tuesday evenings. By the end of the first month it was 9. By spring it was 14, and Emily had moved the classes to the church hall, because the kitchen couldn't hold them anymore, and Millhaven had quietly accepted that Emily Brooks was the person you went to on Tuesday evenings if you wanted to learn to read or do sums or write a letter to a family member back east that said what you actually meant. Daniel watched it happen with the particular quiet pride of a man who knows better than to say too much about something going right. He made sure the kitchen was clean on Tuesday evenings, and that there was wood for the stove, and that the children were managed. And he never once suggested that it was too much work, or that she was stretching herself too thin, because he had known from the beginning, from the first morning on the porch, from the way she had met Cole Garrett at the door, that Emily Harper Brooks did not do things halfway. Clara started sitting in on the classes when she was 5. Nobody officially permitted this. She simply appeared one Tuesday evening, installed herself in a chair at the edge of the group, and began doing what she always did, which was watching everything with the absolute focused attention of a child who has decided that all of it is relevant. By the time Clara was 7, she was helping the newer students with their letters. "Your daughter is teaching my class," Emily told Daniel one night. "Is she doing it right?" he said. "Frighteningly well," Emily said. "Then let her," he said. Thomas at 5 had decided that cattle were more interesting than letters, which was fine by Daniel and slightly baffling to Emily, who had produced what she considered a fairly clear demonstration that letters were where the power actually lived. Thomas was unmoved. He followed Daniel around the operation with the earnest concentration of a boy learning a language, and Daniel taught him with the same patient directness he'd applied to everything in his life. And by the time Thomas was 12, he could manage a cattle count faster than any hand on the property. The years moved in the way that good years do, not slowly, not fast, but with the particular fullness of time that is well used. The homestead became what Emily had not dared to imagine on the first day, not just surviving, but genuinely alive. The garden her mother had kept, that her father had tried to maintain, that the years had stripped bare, that garden came back. Emily rebuilt it in stages over 3 springs, and it grew into something larger than the original, spilling out past the original boundaries, tomatoes and beans, and the lavender that Emily had brought from a catalog and planted against everyone's practical advice, and that had against all expectation flourished. "Lavender doesn't grow well in this climate," Daniel had said when she planted it. "The catalog says it does," Emily had said. He had looked at the lavender. He had looked at her. "Yes, ma'am," he said. The lavender was in its 8th year and showing no signs of stopping. In 1889, the railroad came through. The negotiation took 4 months. Emily handled it herself with Patterson and Elko on one side and the railroad's land agent on the other, and when it was done, she had secured an easement access payment that was, by Patterson's assessment, the highest per-acre rate negotiated by a private landowner in that corridor. He told her so, with the slightly stunned expression he'd had on his face the first time he'd seen her ledger. "You understand," he said, "that the railroad expected to pay half this." "I know," Emily said. "I read their last 3 easement agreements through the Territorial Record Office." She signed the document. "Numbers are a language, Mr. Patterson. I just made sure I was speaking it clearly." Daniel read the final agreement that night at the kitchen table. He read every page of it with the slow, thorough attention he gave to important documents, and when he finished, he set it down and looked at his wife across the table and said nothing for a moment. "Well," she said, "your father told me. He said that you were the best thing he'd ever done." She had heard that before. He'd told her once early on, and it landed differently now than it had then. Now she had children of her own. Now she understood what it cost a person to say something like that and mean it. "He was wrong," she said quietly. "The best thing he did was build this land and hold it long enough for me to come back to it." Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. He held it the way he did most things, without excess, without demonstration, just fully and steadily, and with the specific intention of not letting go. "Same thing," he said. She turned her hand over in his and held on. The years continued. Clara grew into a woman with Emily's precision and Daniel's stillness, and a capability that made people stop mid-sentence when she walked into a room. She married a surveyor from Elko, a good man, methodical and honest, who approached Clara with appropriate caution and stayed because she let him, which Clara's friends agreed was exactly right. Thomas took on more of the ranch operation as Daniel aged, and he did it with the quiet competence of a man who has been learning one thing his whole life and knows it completely. Daniel's hair went silver, then white. He stayed on a horse longer than was probably wise, and Emily told him so, and he said yes, ma'am, and kept riding, and she let him, because she knew by then the difference between stubbornness and the particular kind of dignity that belongs to a man who has spent his whole life working and is not ready to stop. He slowed down in the winter of 1901. Not all at once. Gradually, the way rivers slow, still moving, still themselves just quieter. He spent more mornings at the kitchen table, and fewer in the saddle, and Thomas managed the operation with the ease of someone who has been ready for a long time, and Daniel watched his son work with the specific pride of a man who knows he built something that will outlast him. One morning in March, Emily found him on the porch. He was sitting in the chair he had always preferred, the one on the left side, the one with the better view of the north pasture, and he was looking out at the land with the expression she knew better than any other expression in the world. The looking expression. The one that meant he was paying full attention to something that mattered. She sat beside him. She did not ask how he was feeling. She had been his wife for 26 years, and she did not waste words on questions that only had hard answers. "You remember the first day," he said. "I remember everything about the first day," she said. "You were on your knees in the dust," he said. "I almost didn't stop. I thought woman's having a private moment right on past." He paused. "But you looked up at me, and you didn't look away. Most people look away when they're caught crying." He shook his head slightly. "You didn't." "I didn't have the energy for it," she said. "No," he said. "I think you just never saw the point in hiding the truth from someone who was already looking." He turned to look at her then, and his face was older and deeper, and she loved it more than she had ever loved the younger version of it, which she had loved considerably. "That's who you are, Emily. You don't hide from what's real." "It's caused me trouble," she said. "All the best things do," he said. She took his hand. He held hers. Daniel Brooks passed on a Tuesday in early April when the garden was just beginning to show the first green of the season. He went the way he had always done, most things quietly, without unnecessary drama at home, with the people who mattered most beside him. Clara held his other hand and did not cry until he was gone, and then cried in the way Emily had rarely seen her daughter cry fully and without composure, the way her mother had cried in the dust of this yard 30 years before. Thomas stood in the doorway of the bedroom and removed his hat and held it against his chest and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, and Thomas had always understood that. Emily did not cry that day. She sat beside him for a long time after holding his hand, and she talked to him the way she had always talked to him, plainly, directly, without prettying it up. She told him what she was going to do next. The spring planting schedule, the north pasture fence that needed resetting, the Tuesday class, which had now been running for 20 years and had taught over 100 women in the valley to read. She told him because she had always told him, because for 26 years he had been the person she told things to, and she was not ready to stop, and she suspected she would never entirely stop. The homestead went on. Clara and her husband moved into the main house to be close to Emily, who accepted this arrangement with the dignified practicality of a woman who knows the difference between needing help and accepting company. Thomas ran the ranch. The grandchildren arrived, 4 of them eventually, and they ran through the house and the garden and the barn with the particular fearless energy of children who have been raised to understand that the land beneath their feet belongs to them, was fought for and built for and held for them by people who loved them before they existed. Emily taught the oldest granddaughter, a sharp-eyed girl named Miriam, her first letters at the kitchen table in the same chair where the Tuesday classes had always begun. "Why does it matter?" Miriam asked, in the way that children ask things directly, expecting a real answer. Emily looked at her granddaughter. "Because numbers and letters are a language," she said. "And when you know the language, nobody can speak it around you and leave you out of what's being said." She handed her the pencil. "Now, write your name." Miriam wrote it, carefully, then looked up. "Is that right, Gran?" "That's exactly right," Emily said. She lived to see Miriam read her first full book. She lived to see Thomas's son take his first solo ride on the north pasture and come back grinning with the specific joy of a boy who has done something real. She lived to see the valley change around her, more settlers, more roads. The railroad running clean through the corridor land that Cole Garrett had tried to take, and she watched it all with the interested, clear-eyed attention of a woman who stopped being surprised by what was possible somewhere around 1875. She died in the spring, as she had always preferred springs in the house, in the room that had been rebuilt from ruin, with the lavender coming up outside the window and the sound of the ranch going on around her the way it always had. What she left behind was not complicated. A homestead that had been brought back from nothing. A ledger carefully kept for 26 years that told the whole story in numbers clear enough for anyone to read. A garden that had outlasted every prediction. Tuesday classes that had become a county institution and would continue long after her name was the only thing remembered about their origin. Children and grandchildren who knew how to work and how to love and how to look at hard things without looking away. And the memory sharp and specific and unchanged by all the years of a morning in 1874, a woman on her knees in the dust of a broken yard and a man on a horse who didn't ride past. 4 words. The question that started everything. Tell me what you need. She had not known the answer then. She had built the answer slowly over a lifetime with her own hands and her own numbers and her own stubborn refusal to be invisible. And when she finally had it, it turned out the answer was not complicated either. A piece of land that was hers. Work that meant something. People who told the truth. And someone who asked the question and stayed long enough for the answer to become a life. That was all. That was everything. That was enough.